Your chairmanship, and super to see the Minister, Shadow Minister and many others here today. I want to start by thanking the hundreds of members of the public who have responded to this debate and have sent in their views and thoughts, and pay tribute also to the Education Select Committee, the Children's Commissioner and the many other charities and organisations who've done so much in this area. On the day after the Marmot review, I think it's timely that we're looking at one element of inequality in our society that is moving in the wrong direction and that we need to try and shift, and that is the increasing number of school exclusions. Soon after I became an MP, a mother came to my surgery, and she was distraught because her son, who was on the way to being diagnosed as autistic, and we all know how long those diagnosis periods can be, her son had been doing well at school, come back after half term. Lots of changes had been made to the classroom, and he was very unsettled by that and ended up in a series of demonstrations and behavioural issues over a period of a week. He was permanently excluded from school as a result. He was 5 years old, which I found to be utterly extraordinary. The mother had the wherewithal to come to her MP, to find a charity to help support her. She managed to overturn the appeal. She also happened to be a black woman, and she sat in my surgery and said, "I do not want my son to be another one of those black boys." And it was absolutely horrifying. And I learnt subsequently that that example was not uncommon, and that this is a huge problem. There has been a 70% increase in permanent exclusions since 2012. And just 1% of children who are permanently excluded get a good pass in maths or English at GCSE. Particular concern to me is the link to the epidemic of serious youth violence, which has left hundreds of young people dead on our streets in recent weeks. In Croydon, there was a review of 60 cases of serious violence, 60 young people who were either victims or perpetrators of crime. Of those 60 children, every single child who was convicted of a crime had been excluded from school. And 1 in 3 had been excluded in primary school. We disagree on many things in this place, but I think we can all agree that our children deserve the best start in life, and that no child deserves to be left behind. And I secured this debate because too many children are not getting that start, and too many children are being left behind. And I fear that the draconian language coming from this new government may make the problem worse, not better. Today's debate follows a report from the all-party group on knife crime into the link between violent crime and school exclusions. We set up the all-party group in 2017 to develop solutions to the knife crime crisis. Anecdotally, it had been said to us repeatedly that school exclusions were contributing to a feeling of abandonment and hopelessness among young people vulnerable to crime. We know there's been a correlation. Exclusions have risen by 70% as knife crime has reached the highest levels on record. But it's not enough simply to draw those parallels. So I'll give you.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way and congratulate her on securing the debate. Just on the issue of the spike, which she correctly alludes to, would you agree with me when you look at the figures in the earlier part of the decade, between 2000 and 2010, there seemed to be a drop-off in exclusions, which was welcome, and that we need to fundamentally re-examine why that spike has occurred in the past 4 or 5 years to try and ensure that we get it down again for the very reasons that she's articulating?
I think that's absolutely exactly right. And the peaks and the troughs of school exclusions pretty much mirror the peaks and troughs in knife crime as well. And we need to understand why these things are happening, and we need to actively work to reduce the current peak in school exclusions. So our all-party group, supported by Barnardo's and Red Thread, spoke to young people all across the country who had convictions for knife offences. They told us how being excluded had left them with more time to spend on the streets getting into trouble. We sent a Freedom of Information request to local authorities to better understand the state of provision for children who are excluded, and the research revealed a crisis in support for excluded children. We analysed evidence from organisations such as the IPPR and the difference documents charting the worrying rise in off-rolling grey exclusions, and from the St Giles Trust, whose work with victims of county lines exploitation drew a direct link to those excluded from school. And we know the public has concerns on this issue. Barnardo's polled parents of children under 18, and 3/4 believed that children who are excluded are more at risk of involvement in knife crime. Children have not got 70% naughtier since 2012. Something has gone wrong, and it is leaving vulnerable people exposed to involvement in crime. So my hope today is that the Minister will listen to the evidence that the all-party group has collected, the testimony of other members here today, and agree to take some of our recommendations forward. To look quickly at the statistics, for England, in the year 2017-18, which is the latest data, there were 7,900 permanent exclusions, the 70% increase I talked about. The highest levels were in Redcar and Cleveland, and the highest levels for fixed period exclusion rates were in Hartlepool. Half of all excluded children have special educational needs. Yet support for special educational needs has seen some of the biggest cuts. Figures for 2019 estimate cuts to SEN funding of 17% per pupil since 2015. The SEN type most affected in terms of exclusions was those under social, emotional and mental health categories. There is... Yes, I will give way.
It's my honourable friend earlier in his speech made reference to children with autism being excluded. Also, apart from autism, is ADHD. The prison population is overrepresented by people with ADHD. So does she agree with me that the Mayor of London is investing £4.7 million to tackle school exclusions via the Violence Reduction Unit, that the government would do well to follow the example of the Mayor of London and invest more in support for schools and with children who are vulnerable?
My honourable friend has anticipated something I was going to say later, which is that there are many organisations that are pushing against the tide and trying to address these very difficult issues. There is a link with the child's family income and exclusion. The worse off economically a child is, the more likely they are to be excluded. Children who are eligible for free school meals are 4 times more likely to be excluded from school. There is a link with ethnicity. Rates are higher amongst mixed race and black pupils. There is a link with gender. Males are over twice as likely to be excluded as females. And there is a link with geography, where you live. The rate of permanent exclusions for the most deprived areas is higher than the least deprived areas. And we know there is a link to then what happens in future life. 42% of adult prisoners and 90% of young offenders were excluded from school. At the same time as the number of exclusions have increased, the numbers of pupil referral units, AP academies and AP free schools have decreased. The number of APs has steadily fallen from 349 in 2013 down to 349 down to 328 in 2017-18. Yet the number of pupils has risen year on year. The number of fixed period exclusions in these schools has risen dramatically from 15,500 in 2013 to 26,500 in 2017, suggesting a growing inability to cope with the pressures internally. Turning to knife crime, we've had 44,771 offences in the year ending 2019. That's the highest on record, up from a point of 23,751 for the year ending March 2014. That's an 88.5% increase over that period. And for the year ending March 2019, juveniles, those aged 10 to 17, were the offenders in 1 in 5 cases. So our research and our report into the link between knife crime and exclusion. Barnardo's surveyed all local authorities in schools and all local authorities in England, and 80% responded. They discovered that 1 in 3 councils have no vacant places in their pupil referral units. Even where there is space, there's a postcode lottery in terms of the quality of support provided. Nationally, almost 1 in 5 spaces are in alternative provision that Ofsted has rated inadequate or requires improvement. It is likely that pupils who are not being educated in the state sector are being educated in non-maintained provision And many of us will have seen this in our caseload. Families are sometimes strongly encouraged to home educate.
Oh, yes.
These may be offering quality provision. Many of the alternative providers offer quality provision, but there is also a problem with the fact that many of them are not full-time, breaking the statutory obligation to our young people. Every excluded child is legally entitled to full-time education in alternative provision, but our investigation found that is not happening, with some excluded children getting as little as 2 hours schooling a day. The system is at breaking point, and not just because of the 70% rise in official exclusions. Research from the IPPR on the difference revealed that the number of children in AP is 5 times higher than the number of officially permanently excluded pupils. They found that the true number of children in AP is around 50,000, with growing use of managed moves and off-rolling that, again, many of us will have heard about from our caseload. The report by the St Giles Trust I referred to earlier was commissioned by the Home Office, and it looked at the issue of children running drugs between London and Kent. And it found that 100% of the children involved were not in mainstream education and were either in AP or not in any form of education at all. The Mayor of London produced research which found that excluded pupils are particularly vulnerable to exploitation in criminal gangs, with 9 in 10 young people in London in custody excluded. The Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime research indicates that pupils in alternative provision are more likely to know someone in a gang or who carries a knife than those in the mainstream setting. Professionals giving evidence to our all-party group believed criminal gangs are aware of how school exclusions can increase vulnerability and were seeking to exploit this fact. We even heard about pupil referral units where criminals would wait outside and ask people if they wanted to be involved in county lines as they left the pupil referral unit. These strong correlations do not prove, of course, that school exclusions are causing knife crime. Just because you're excluded does not mean you're going to become a criminal at all. And school exclusion is often a symptom of vulnerability for many years throughout your life. But there is a common thread running through all the vulnerable children who are being excluded, and there is a great deal of commonality between the issues they face and those who carry knives. They are not getting the support they need from a system that is failing them catastrophically. The Timpson Review was released last May, and the government is yet to act on any of its findings. The review had several important findings which chime with the all-party group's findings, particularly around off-rolling and the quality of alternative provision. I'm sure the Honourable Member for Esbury will want to go through that in more detail, but suffice to say it's disappointing to see the lack of action on such a crucial issue, and after being presented with so many clear recommendations from that report and our all-party group. The previous Education Secretary, Damien Hines, said in 2018 he would not rule out legislation to ensure more accountability for schools that permanently exclude children and place them in alternative provision. But there have been no changes to school exclusions legislation in England in the last 12 months. The government said in response to the Timpson Review it would launch a consultation. This consultation has yet to be launched. And the response also said that the government would rewrite its guidance on exclusions and behaviour and discipline, which it's yet to do. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and congratulate her on having this Westminster Hall debate on such a vital issue. Schools like Northolt High School in my constituency of Ely North want to keep exclusions as low as possible. They know the importance of doing so and they want to do it in a positive, inclusive way, but they need funding for this. And so they've submitted an expression of interest to the John Lyon Charities Excluded Initiative, which is being run with the Evening Standard and others to fund their inclusion programme. Now, Northolt should be strongly commended for taking this initiative, but I'm concerned that such an important programme may only go ahead if they are successful in getting charitable funding through a scheme that will no doubt be overbid. If Northolt are unsuccessful in their bid to the Excluded Initiative, would my honourable friend join me in urging the Minister to commit to meeting with their excellent head teacher and others who may miss out on such bids to see if other funding can be found to support their plans?
Thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I know the Minister is always very obliging in terms of agreeing to meetings, so I'm sure he will do that. And he makes a very good point about the Evening Standard campaign, which is very worthy and to be commended greatly, but is no replacement to what the state should be legally providing for our children. So there were warm words post the Timpson review, but the new Conservative administration seems to lack any recognition of the link between exclusions and crime and seems worryingly relaxed about the exclusion of children. The Conservative manifesto put an emphasis on backing head teachers to exclude children and a sinister suggestion of creating secure schools for young offenders, all the while failing to restore the per-pupil funding which was cut from our schools. A greater emphasis on teachers being able to discipline children, 10,000 more prison sentences in place, and secure schools for young offenders. All of these things are draconian measures to deal with problems that would be far better dealt with if we tackled the underlying causes in the first place.
Hear, hear.
And it is blatantly obvious that funding cuts have meant that schools are increasingly unable to properly support the heightened needs of students, particularly those with special educational needs. When I surveyed head teachers in Croydon, the vast majority had cut SEN funding due to their funding issues. And it's no wonder that they then are overwhelmed and that so many SEN children are excluded. As has already been mentioned, there are many organisations, large and small, working against the tide to try and help this situation. From Another Night in Sisterhood in Croydon, a very small organisation that works to try and support parents who don't know how to deal with potential exclusion, to the Mayor of London, who's awarded £4.7 million to areas of London blighted by youth violence to prevent pupils from being excluded. And I want to again pay tribute to the Evening Standard's £1 million campaign, The Excluded, which aims to encourage greater inclusion in schools by funding inclusion units. And 57 applications from local schools have already been made. It's modelled on what was done in Glasgow, where they reduced exclusions by 85% alongside the Scottish VRU, and it's modelled on pioneering London schools like Dunraven in Lambeth. Turning to what needs to be done, our all-party group investigation concluded last year and made a series of recommendations which I hope the Minister will look at, and perhaps he would agree to come to the all-party group to discuss their implementation in the future. School rankings and results must take account of all pupils, including those they exclude. All excluded children must have access to the full-time education they're legally entitled to. Many do not currently get this. All education providers must have the funding and backing they need to support vulnerable children. Schools must be recognised for the central role they play in a multi-agency response to keeping children safe, with funding to support this work. Everyone working in the education sector must be trained to understand vulnerability and trauma. I've been on trauma training, and it really does change the way you view a child. You know, Indeed. Anger is a cry for help, and understanding these issues is enormously useful for teaching. Schools should be supported to focus on prevention and early intervention, and every council should have a leader responsible for children excluded from school. We know these things can be done. In Scotland, only 5 pupils were permanently removed from the classroom in 2016-17. South Tyneside exclusion rates fell by almost 60% over the last 10 years. Wandsworth used to have one of the highest rates of permanent school exclusions, now one of the lowest. And schools in my own constituency, like St Mary's, managed to exclude tiny numbers of people despite really challenging intake and really challenging issues. So the questions that I would put to the Minister are, fundamentally, does he recognise the issues that I'm talking about? And fundamentally, does he want to see a reduction in school exclusions, or is he happy to continue to see an increase at this rate? Why are so many vulnerable children getting less support than they would in mainstream school, especially since in many cases excluded children are exactly the children that need more support? Will the Minister conduct a review into capacity within the alternative provision and part-time education to understand if there are enough resources to ensure that all pupils who are excluded get full-time provision they're legally entitled to? And given that half of all excluded children have special educational needs, what steps is he taking to make up for the vast funding cuts seen to SEN support? As concluded by the Education Select Committee's inquiry into knife crime, schools play a central role in providing prevention and early intervention and in a multi-agency response to keeping children safe. Violent crime has doubled over recent years, with more and more young people dying on our streets. There is no single causal factor when it comes to knife crime. If there were, we would have solved it before now. We need to look at this epidemic from every possible angle and focus on preventing crime before it occurs. Exclusions must be a last resort, and alternative provision must be full-time, high quality and properly resourced. We can cure the epidemic of youth violence if we start from the principle that no child is left behind.